Well, generally, this is fairly costly flight test data, takeoff and landing distance. And it's some of the more difficult to obtain because one, it either takes some pretty sophisticated instrumentation, and you got a large number of variables, and one of the bigger ones being pilot technique. You will find when doing these that you need to do a fairly large number of runs. I like to do, if I can, at least 10 different runs. Because with the same pilot, if you get 10 different pilots, you'll get 10 different answers. There's that much pilot technique in it. And actually, when you start preparing for these tests, you don't want to start taking data immediately. Let the pilot do some to determine what the best technique for he or she is. Due to this fact, up until, well, fairly recently, and I kind of guess that depends on how old you are. For you all, it was probably a long time ago, but for me, it was fairly recently. The FAA didn't require, if you go back to CAR3, the FAA did not require that you do measure takeoff distance, due to the fact that there was so much scatter in the data. Along came the Environmental Protection Agency. And for quite a while, even though you had to measure noise, you did it in a flyover kind of thing, 1,000-foot flyover. Well, then they said, well, no, probably, what the noise that really affects things is takeoff. And so then they started requiring measuring takeoff distance. Now, for airplanes in excess of 6,000 pounds takeoff gross weight, there has always been a requirement to measure it. But for small airplanes like the Cherokee 6, there was not a requirement in the old days. When that airplane was manufactured, there was not a requirement that Piper measure the takeoff or landing distance. Now, competition drove them to do so. But if you're a pilot who buys one of those airplanes and looks in the handbook and sees what Piper gives for takeoff distance, I wouldn't, and if you had a tree, a 50-foot tree at the end of the runway there, I wouldn't try to clear it, okay? You may end up in a tree, is what I'm saying. So, this was part of it. It's just due to the fact that there's so many variables are involved in this kind of distance. Yes, sir.
What about Part 25?
Part 25 has always been there. Now, there's an interesting thing about Part 25. Part 25 requires that you clear a 35-foot obstacle. Part 23 requires you clear a 50-foot obstacle. Now, you would think
The other way around.
it'd be the other way around, right?
You're, the one of them's a lot more your bush pilot type of stuff, but you're just gonna hit that 50-foot.
Yeah, that's where it came from, is that the airports that airline pilots fly out of have generally longer runways, and they have a larger cleared area where obstacles can't be quite so high, and that's where it came from. However, they still require a 50-foot obstacle for landing for Part 25 airplanes. So, they're not really consistent in that regard.
Are the numbers any better, Tom? For Part 25 when it comes to.
Not a lot, no.
No.
But they can afford fancier instrumentation, so they can, get a little better. One of the things, the old rules, the old Car 3 rules. See, back in the days when the FAA, they weren't called the FAA then, they were called the Bureau of Air Commerce. And they were part of the Commerce Department in the United States. The first regulation took place in 1926. Okay, prior to that, anybody could build their own airplane, teach themselves to fly it, and had no rules whatsoever. But the reason was that the rules came about was insurance. They could not get insurance. None of the insurance companies would write them a policy. And so the aviation industry was the only industry to ever ask to be regulated. And they asked to be regulated, but they said, regulate us, but not too much. Okay? And this is the truth. This is a true story, okay? They asked to be regulated. But the people who put this together said, hey, we want the original charter for Bureau of Air Commerce, and it carried all the way through up until the year 2002, I think, when the Value jet crashed down in the Everglades. Prior to that, the FAA charter said the purpose of the FAA was to promote and regulate aviation. With that, they found out that, the FAA overseers for that airline had been a little too much in bed with the airline. And so they took the promote out of the FAA charter. And things changed significantly when that happened. Prior to that, and during the old CAR 3 days, CAR 3, Civil Air Regulation 3, the FAA pretty much, was helpful. Today, they're more like cops. All right, they're enforcers, not promoters. Okay, so it's worthwhile to understand that, to realize how the regs have changed and grown over the years. So anyway, that's my little soapbox issue for today. But anyway, well, if you talk about the theory for takeoff and landing, generally we divide it into two segments: a ground distance segment and an air distance segment. And the FAA would allow you to actually measure the ground distance segment and then tack on a climb segment. So you wouldn't have to actually do a takeoff per se. You could do an accelerate and stop. Okay, you can see where we're going here, because the landing is the stop part, right? The accelerate is the takeoff ground distance. Okay, so they would allow you to do that, and so that's where this comes from, the ground distance segment and the air distance segment. Well, we'll talk about the ground distance first. It's affected by at least all these factors I've got up there, maybe a few more. Wind, slope of the runway, airplane weight, of course, air density, air temperature, pilot technique, and runway surface condition. In Australia, to tell this story, when I went to work at Beach back in the late 60s, me and another guy hired in at the same time. And I was given the takeoff and landing distances for the US flight manual for the Beech Model 99 commuter airline. The other guy who hired in was given the same chore for the airplane for the Australian handbook. Now, the Australian handbook, when we talk about runway surface condition, in Australia, they have a number of strange runways, okay? They have some that are uphill or downhill, that are grass, hard surface. They have tall, wet grass, tall, short, wet grass.
Kangaroos
tall
on the runway, I've seen that too.
I mean, it just goes on and on. Like, what happened was 2 years later, I'd moved on to other projects. About the time I left Beach, this poor guy had just finished all of the data for the Australian flight manual. It took him 2 years to come up with all these various conditions that he had to do. And of course, the other thing, the Australian said, you can't, if you use a test pilot to do these tests, then you've got to add a factor for the average pilot. And I think the factor was like 20% or something like that you had to add to the distances for the average pilot. US doesn't require that, but anyway, it was kind of, like I said, kind of funny. That poor guy was working on that whole thing for 2 years.
There was a regulation down there, I was down there on assignment for a year and a half, I did some flying down there. They will not, there's a regulation that you cannot take off with a tailwind down there.
Oh, yes, that's the other thing. Evidently, the tower crew must have a wheelbarrow full of handbooks for every airplane that was ever made. Because if the crosswind is more than the approved crosswind, they won't give you takeoff clearance.
See, I was overregulated. They got more ratings and certificates down there than I can't imagine. I was happy to get back to the States.
Right.
I took their written exam, the commercial written exam. It was a stack of books this high, about $400 worth of stuff, and you buy the foreign aid, it's about that thick for $20 from Sporties. It was just, I was happy to come back to the States after my experience down there. I was like, this is awful.
Yes, well, like I say, it's an example of how you can regulate an industry out of business.
It's horrible. It's overregulated, it really is, yeah. And they think they do a lot better than we do.
Yeah, right.
And I was like, okay, we got more operations on a daily basis than your 2 airplanes.
Yeah, that was always in certification when I worked at Piper. In order to, sell the airplanes, you wanted to get the maximum crosswind components you could get. Well, here in Florida sometimes, you can't, getting a decent crosswind is pretty hard to do. And, but if your handbook said that your crosswind component was 15 knots, that was it. You couldn't take off if it was 16 knots.
Yeah.
Anyway, here's what's going on. In normal flight, of course, we've got, four things. We've got thrust and drag and lift and weight. But during takeoff, we add one more, and that's a rolling friction on the tires, and particularly during the ground portion of the thing. And the equation for that acceleration looks something like this. Again, it's just Newton's second law with a few terms thrown in. And where mu is the coefficient of friction of the tires on the runway, and of course that is changing during the takeoff roll. Propeller-driven airplanes, accelerating force is initially high but decreases as the velocity increases. Jet, it's pretty much constant through the takeoff roll. And we can say that the terms inside the brackets in that first equation up there is the total resistance to the takeoff roll, and we just put it this way: resistance is a drag plus the rolling friction, and of course the weight minus the lift, and of course during that roll the lift is changing, and so this term is changing during the thing. You can write it in coefficient form. You can see though that, you know, you'd have to integrate that across the takeoff roll to be able to make it work out. So what a lot of folks do is just take a mean value of that during the takeoff roll. And if we differentiate that last thing though, it's, we come up with an interesting little ditty. And if we differentiate that with respect to lift coefficient, it comes out something like this. Well, it turns that these things, most of them are constants, and we can come up with an optimum lift coefficient, which is pi times the aspect ratio times Oswald's efficiency factor, E, times mu. Now, we said that E is pretty hard to determine, but that's kind of interesting. That's a constant. So what we'd like to do is, you know, be able to have the lift coefficient as a constant through the road. Well, generally we don't have enough control authority to do that, because at very low speed, to get that kind of lift coefficient, you'd probably have to go to, you know, rotate the airplane to considerable angle of attack that you can't do. But it's just kind of interesting stuff to look at. But they're independent of weight, altitude, winds, and what have you. And so an angle attack indicator would be a valuable tool to work towards an optimum takeoff. Like I say, although it appears promising, it may not be possible due to control power limitations. If we go back to our original acceleration equation, we can find variables that are functions of velocity, and of course are constantly changing during the takeoff roll. And so we usually just use mean values for this. So in all our performance involving takeoff or climb, excess thrust is important, and we can express it as shown on that last equation. And if we look at this from a work done standpoint, essentially the work done during the takeoff roll is equal to the gain in kinetic energy. So this being the ground distance of the takeoff is equal to the weight divided by acceleration times the net thrust minus the mean resistance times v squared takeoff velocity over 2. So the big player there is the takeoff velocity. So we'd like to get that. If we want to get the distance short, we want to get the velocity pretty slow, right? So if we solve for the ground roll, well, we can do this sort of thing. And ground roll is going to be dependent on the speed. So flaps or other high lift devices are effective, and generally, you know, on many airplanes, if you'll notice when we fly the Cherokee 6, for takeoff, we usually put out about 15 degrees of flap. You know, the first notch of flap for takeoff on the airplane helps us reduce the takeoff distance. The air distance portion, many airplanes, the shortest ground roll may not mean the shortest distance over an obstacle, since we have to also consider the air distance. Many airplanes, if you get them off the ground at too low a speed, they're not going to accelerate as quickly and to best climb speed. So, you know, it's a little trade-off. The factors affecting the air distance, well, pretty much the same as those affecting ground distance. Yes, sir.
When you count for pilot technique, do you also count for flaps configuration and things like that?
Yes, you would generally do them, you know, I mean, particularly in the early stages of determining takeoff distance, you would probably try, you know, with flaps and without flaps to see which ended up giving you the best distance. And you know, the pilot may need to do several takeoffs in order to determine the best technique for each configuration. Well, during this air distance phase, the airplane is both climbing and accelerating, okay? It gets airborne, but if it doesn't accelerate very fast, then the distance is going to get longer. So you want the combination there of climb and acceleration to be kind of optimal. Again, you can look at that from the work standpoint, and here's the equation. The SA is the air distance, and the equation looks this. However, you notice the velocity, we have the takeoff velocity and the end term, minus the velocity at 50 feet. So those two are going to be different over 2G, and if we solve for the air distance, it looks something like this. We have to put the 50 feet in there. That's the obstacle. If that was a transport airplane, for that equation, it would be 35 feet would go in that place. And then the total distance over the obstacle, of course, is just the ground distance and the air distance. Well, landing is evaluated in a similar manner and has most of the same problems in achieving good data. It's divided into two segments, as we did with takeoff, and but it occurs in reverse. Landing ground roll, and I'm talking about them here, you know, this occurs last, the air distance occurs first. But, you know, let's look at the air distance first. If we notice, you know, again, we got the mean value of thrust minus drag, but in this case, the drag is going to be higher than the thrust because you'd like the thrust to be idle or very minimal.
So this is from 50 feet.
From 50 feet, yes. From 50
actual